On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee stepped out of the McLean House, having surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant and his Army of the Potomac. One of the South's major armies had laid down their arms. Most people in their story of the Civil War are there, with Lee and his now paroled army. But that is not the end of the Confederacy. On April 9th, that was only one army surrendering. The Confederate government and its president, Jefferson Davis, were on the run, but it still claimed some dominion over portions of southern states through its various military outposts. It would take months for the Union to capture and take control over the various military forces roaming the southern states. So that begs the question, when did the Civil War end? Welcome to Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and this video seeks to expand on our common notion of when the Civil War ended. I will be using an excellently written and argued book by Gregory Downs called After Appomattox, Military Occupation and the Ends of War. On April 8, 1865, Robert E. Lee sent a message to Ulysses S. Grant asking for peace. Grant's aides dismissed Lee's offer out of hand. The rebel general wanted to entrap them into making a treaty of peace, they thought. They stated that is the prerogative of the President or the Senate. A month earlier, President Abraham Lincoln had reminded Grant that politicians, not generals, would set the terms of peace. Grant went to bed without responding to Lee's letter. When he arose the next morning, the Union Army commander penned a response saying, "I have no authority to treat on a subject of peace," but they could discuss surrender. In his book, Downs says, when Lee agreed to the surrender terms, it confirmed that the war was fundamentally a political, not just a military conflict, and its terms would be set by politicians. By allowing the United States to utilize war powers years after battlefield fighting stopped, the continuation of the wartime gave the national government the necessary authority to suppress the rebellion, consolidate its forces, and fashion effective civil rights. Downs uses this exchange to set up his argument that the war did not end with Lee's surrender or the surrender of any Confederate army. It ended when the United States government discontinued its usage of war powers when all the southern states were brought back into the Union and given back their full political rights. His book is part of a historiography on the long Civil War that goes beyond military conflict and factors in a lot of political and social changes that emerged out of the war to determine that the Civil War was longer than those 4 years in the 1860s. He comes at it from a strictly political approach, saying to lawyers and policymakers, wartime did not necessarily mean battles, nor did it mean their expansive cultural consequences. It meant a legal state that shaped government power and ended at a precise moment with the dawn of peace. And since the United States remained in a state of wartime for 3 years after surrender in some rebel states and for more than 5 years in others, peacetime finally came in 1871. One thing I do like about this book is his tackling of the Appomattox myth that permeates Americans' minds. When we say Appomattox Courthouse, people's minds immediately think of the end of hostilities, but that simply is not true. That location saw the surrender of one army. Confederate armies continued to exist after Lee surrendered. As Downs says, the Appomattox myth carries the weight of the birth of a nation. Forged in sacrifice and respect and forgiveness, the family returned home under one roof. Unfortunately, the war continued on militarily for a few more months, and politically, it continued for much longer. An example of the United States using its war powers during peacetime is the habeas corpus bill that Congress passed. Southern states began filing lawsuits against the actions of Union soldiers in their respective states. In a period of peacetime, soldiers could be sued or arrested. During occupation, however, the military was supreme. This protected soldiers by letting soldiers use orders as a defense and by allowing them to remove cases from unsympathetic local courts to federal courts. Downs uses these legal battles within the states and between the states and the federal government to illustrate that a time of war still existed because under peacetime circumstances, this would not be legal. So therefore, the nation was still gripped in a war, just by a different means. One of the biggest weaknesses of his argument that the war continued after Appomattox is his insistence on violence by ex-Confederates being considered warfare. He points to the New Orleans massacre, where a white mob murdered 34 black men and 4 white men who were supporting the new Constitution for the state of Louisiana in July 1866. But this was not the act of an army attacking another army, but a terroristic act aimed at stopping a political proceeding from taking place, not an act of what we would consider war, and definitely not the actions of the long-gone Confederate government. The ensuring of civil rights granted to African Americans due to the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments occupies a large portion of his argument as to why the war continued past 1865. Supporters of freed people's rights agreed to keep the Army in the South to ensure that Southern states and ex-Confederates did not attempt to take away the civil rights of African Americans. The occupation of the South signaled to the author that the war continued because Congress and the military still used its powers over the defeated states. When all the Southern states were back in the Union and after all their representatives were seated in Congress in 1871, is when Downs believes the war itself was over, because they could govern themselves instead of by the military. Now, I personally do not agree with his argument. It is a well thought out book and well argued. However, he tries to redefine war. I define war as a conflict between two armed forces. So when the Confederate government folded and its army surrendered, the war itself came to an end. What followed was strictly Reconstruction, not a continuation of the war. I do agree that Appomattox contains a myth that the war ended on April 9, 1865, because there were still Confederate forces all over the South still operating against the United States. I don't know when we should officially end the conflict, but it's definitely before 1871. Does it end with Joseph E. Johnston's surrender at the end of April, or with the surrender of the CSS Shenandoah on November 6, 1865, it being the last formal Confederate force to still operate as if it was still in wartime? Or should we give that honor to Stan Waddy and his Native American Confederate force who surrendered on June 23, 1865, being the last general to formally surrender? Or if we were talking about full generals, Edmund Kirby Smith was the last full general to surrender, and he did so on June 2nd. I know that various generals left the country and some didn't surrender, but they did not control a significant fighting force. But all of these examples begs the question, when did the Civil War end? Personally, I would actually argue that it was a gradual ending. Lee's surrender started a chain reaction of armies and smaller units capitulating to the Union forces, and honestly, any of them could claim the title of ending the war. But in April 1865, following the surrender of Lee and Johnston, any resistance by Confederates would have been a waste of life, but that could be said even before Lee surrendered, since the Union was rapidly expanding their control over and occupying the South. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree with Downs, or do you have an opinion about which army surrender represented the end of the Civil War? Thank you all, and have a great day.
Historian, historian, where do you roam? Historian, historian, far, far from home. Have history will travel reads the card of a man, a professor with knowledge in the heartland. To educate the world is his mission. A professor of fortune is a man called historian. Historian.